Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. This is the Grad Connection. I'm Jamie Moeller, and the whole point of these videos and all the things I'm trying to do is to help graduate students do more than just survive. I want to see you thrive. And so, what I was thinking about this week, I really kind of struggled on what I was going to talk about, and then all of a sudden it just kind of gelled. Um, so I want to talk about not just today, not today's video, but also a couple more videos I want to do. I want to talk about what I call scripts that work. Now, what I mean by scripts that work, basically, scripts give you a way when you're working with teams or you're working in a professional environment, really when you're working in any environment with other people, it gives you a way to address certain types of problems, certain types of situations. Because there are certain things that working with human beings, there are situations that seem repetitive, and the specifics may be a little bit different. But generally speaking, the addressing the problem or dealing with whatever the issue is consistent, regardless of who you're dealing with. And so that's why I kind of like scripts. Scripts give you a something you can kind of fall back on. But essentially, to me, it's a way of addressing issues or a way of communicating that is effective in general. So that's first of all what scripts are. Second, the thing about scripts is the thing you have to be careful of is if they're too formulaic. That is, if you try to do it too repetitive, oftentimes people will catch on, or it may seem kind of like a fake conversation, or that you're being manipulative, or those kinds of things. So you have to become somewhat flexible in the way that you use scripts. You can't just be cookie cutter with it every time. And then the last thing I would say about scripts are that there's not a script for everything. So you also have to be able to improvise and to try to be able to have conversations and figure out ways to communicate that may not be based on scripts, right? But certainly scripts help, particularly with difficult conversations. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I presented something called what I called the conflict communication wheel, which is really founded in something called the awareness wheel. If you'll remember, it's basically this idea of when you need to address behavioral problems, you say, I observe some behavior. It makes me think this. It makes me feel this. What I need is this. And that's a very important step in it, is because oftentimes we don't address what we need in relationships or in situations. So first is to address what you're needing. And usually it's something to do with behavior change, right? The behaviors that you're observing that are negative, or at least affecting you negatively, that you're requesting. And then lastly is the opportunity where you ask the person, can you do that? Where you give the person the ability to commit or respond to your behavior request or your behavior change request. So that's an example of a script, right? And I've used that one time and time again, as I talked about in the prior video. If you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to go back and watch that video, just as an example of scripts. But I was thinking this morning about what I could talk about, and it came to mind as, that's not just the only script that I'm aware of. Number one, it's also not the only script that I use in any consistent way. So the next couple of weeks, I'm probably going to talk about these things. The first one, we talked about the awareness wheel, or the conflict communication wheel, or conflict communication script already. What I want to talk about today is something that, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from Tom Henschel, and I will reference this in the show notes, but part of what I want to talk about today is rooted in something that he talks about, which is disagreeing agreeably. So I want to talk about how you do that, and I would encourage you to go watch his show, because there's an additional set of scripts that he provides. I'm not going to provide it here because it really requires more explanation than I have time to. But the first part of his talk, or the first part of his session, I really like. The second, or actually, excuse me, the third kind of scripts that I want to talk about is actually from the book called The Coaching Habit that I referred to at one of my videos, by Michael. Do I have it here? Oh, there it is. Excuse me. Not very coordinated here, but Coaching Habit, right? By Michael Bungay Stanier. I was actually listening to a podcast this week between him and Brene Brown. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. But he goes in and he really talks about the coaching habit. I'll probably do a video on it at some point. It's one that's newer to me and that I'm learning to integrate. It's a really hard one to integrate. And if you listen to that podcast between Brene and Michael, you'll kind of get the sense of, it comes very natural to him, but it's not very natural for me and for a lot of people. And even Brene, it's kind of interesting because they have this real-time dialogue that they go through. So I encourage you to look at that. That'll be in the show notes. So I want to talk a little bit about the coaching habit, and then the last one I want to talk about is what I titled, and I can't remember where I got this. I don't know if it's something that I observed somebody doing, and I just wrote down the different approaches that person was using, or if it comes from somewhere. But what I would call how you invite response or dialogue, particularly like if you're teaching or if you're communicating in a way like this, how can you get the people listening to you, learners, students, whoever you're talking to, the people in your audience, how do you get them to respond when it's a live scenario? So, and it's a series of questions, right? It's basically their scripts, right? And so next couple of weeks, I want to focus on those, and I'm not sure I'm going to do them in that order. Probably whatever feels right as far as the order. I've already talked about the awareness wheel. You can see that. So I want to talk about disagreeing agreeably. So the very first piece that I want to talk about relative to disagreeing, how to disagree agreeably, is this really kind of touched a chord with me because oftentimes, because I'm a detail type A, OCD, anally retentive type of personality, oftentimes when somebody presents an idea, my mind immediately goes to all the reasons why that might not work. Because I'm the type of person, I'm not a big picture person. I'm better at once somebody presents a big picture, figuring out how to get from point A to point B, like the logistics part of it. And using Senec's word, I'm more of a how leader than a why leader, right? And so one of the things I'll say is the negative of that is oftentimes I can crush an idea very easily and come off as offensive, as being disagreeable when ideas are presented or when I think differently, when I see something in a different way, or if I think that an idea may not work. So this had a particular effect on me because it gives me a way to approach this where it softens it, where I'm not quite so sharp. So the idea is, and again, this is from Tom Henschel talking about disagreed, and I've got some other points that I want to make too, but talks about, when somebody presents an idea, rather than immediately saying, well, that won't work, that's my normal thing, that's normally how I would say it, instead of immediately jumping on it and kind of, crushing the idea or whatever, instead use this kind of three-step thing. First of all, just kind of or ponder it in some way, give some kind of response that that you're finding it interesting, number one. And then second is to actually say that, that's interesting. And then the most important part of this script is what follows, where you say, I think a little bit differently, or I see that differently, or I feel a little bit differently about that than you do. So by presenting it that way, you're not, first of all, you're not crushing the idea and throwing it out outright, the other person's ideas or thoughts. You're not trying to create this, well, my idea is better than, because if you've ever been in conversation with somebody or watched a conversation between two people where somebody tells a story and then this one tries to one up that story and then this one tries to one up, and it just gets into one-upmanship, uh, it gets out of that where you're trying to wager these ideas. It's basically providing space for that feeling or that idea by the other person, but then also adding your own without like substituting or ranking them or trying to get into some competition. So basically the script is, that's interesting, but I think a little bit differently about that. And I've over the last, I don't know, probably the last 2 or 3 years, I try to consciously go to this script. Because I mean, when you're using scripts, one of the hard things is it's easy to hear somebody talk about a script. Second is it's harder to actually integrate it, right? And it's hard to integrate because one, you have to consciously break patterns that you normally would do. Like you would if somebody presents an idea, my normal response would be to jump in and say, well, that won't work because of this, right? And so that's my first response. So first of all, I have to catch myself doing that, and then third, I have to integrate the new script. So first of all would be this idea of this three-part script. Now, a couple other thoughts that I have, and some of these are script-like, but I think they go along with disagreeing agreeably. So the second thing that I would say, aside from that initial script, is just realize that silence is a virtue. And I would encourage, when you're in conversations with other people, or fight the urge to interrupt them. If you come up with an idea, fight. And I have a bad habit of this. I always excuse it as, oh, I'm trying not to forget. But the reality is it's just a bad habit to try to speak over people. And so first is just to fight that urge, because when somebody presents an idea, this script that I just gave you, that's interesting, I think differently about it. That's not really going to work if you just suddenly pound into the middle of their phrase. Let them get it out. So silence is a virtue. So we've got the script, silence, and not interrupting. Third, I would encourage you to, and again, I know this is coming from somewhere. I wrote it in my notes, and I'm not sure where some of these pieces come from, because I collect these things, and oftentimes I may or may not, because they're scattered thoughts that I put in a journal, and I'm not really sure. Sometimes I try to write where they're from. So anyway, number three, attack with humility. And another kind of script-like element that you can use is, kind of a script where you would say, I'm going to lay out my argument, and you tell me why I'm wrong, rather than saying you're wrong and here's why. Right? Instead, say, I'm going to lay this out for you, and you tell me. And so essentially, you're approaching it with humility, acknowledging that it may have some flaws, and may have some holes, and it gives the other person the opportunity to engage in a non-threatening, non-confrontational way. So that's number three, and that's more kind of like, to me, that's a script-like element. Here's another script-like element would be, kind of ease into your argument, right? So another kind of transitional phrase that you can use. I think there are a couple points worth noting here. I think there are a couple additional points worth considering, right? So that's a script-like element that you can use when in conversation. And then the last thing that I want to note is make sure that you're arguing the point and not making it a personal thing. So here, for example, using phrases like "Here's my problem with that," as opposed to "Here's my problem with you." Right? And so here's my problem with this behavior, as opposed to here's my problem with you, right? So again, this is more script like. And a lot of these things, some of it is having kind of rote things that you can actually say, but some of it's also just watching the words that you use, because it's the nuances of those words that kind of can be trigger points, right? And so focusing on that. So hopefully, so this kind of gives you a range of scripts, but the whole point of all of this is trying to find ways to disagree, but try to disagree agreeably and not come off as too sharp. And this is something that I've had to work on in myself. I am not perfect at it by any stretch of the imagination. Something that I think a lot of these things are life's work. Meaning you may work on it an entire lifetime, and you may never get it perfect. I doubt that, I doubt that I'll ever get this perfect, but I'm going to continue to work on this, because every time I do that, I get better in the way that I communicate. I get, things just work out better in relationships, and I'm still getting tasks. Because this is kind of like attending to not just getting tasks done professionally, but also maintaining relationships. And again, I come back to this idea of you have to be able to do both if you're going to be successful, particularly as a leader, but probably in lots of other ways too. So hopefully you found this useful. Again, I just want to encourage you, those of you who have commented, liked, and subscribed to the content on YouTube, I very much appreciate that. I would encourage you to continue to engage on Facebook via the private Facebook group called The Grad Connection. You can also connect with me just in general on Facebook or LinkedIn. If that's a way that you want to get the content, that's also another way. So I would just encourage you, and hopefully you're finding this. I know the time that I'm recording this is kind of like the wrap up of the semester. Matter of fact, I think today is the last day for graduate students to defend at Purdue. And so for those of you who have defended, and I know a couple of you, I won't call you by name, but you know who you are, that are kind of associated with what I'm doing here, I do congratulate you. I'm proud of you. And I see nothing but success for your future. If you're kind of not quite finished up yet, but you're at the end of the semester, it's been a hectic year for all of us. If you're a graduate student, for sure. And so I would encourage you, hopefully you get some time for a breather and a little bit of relaxation as we kind of have this little lull between the summer, quote unquote, summer semester and fall or spring semester. But nevertheless, hopefully you found this content helpful. Just know that I'm always here. If you ever need someone to bounce an idea off of, whether you're a Purdue student or not, I guess that really doesn't matter. But I kind of see one of the most important things I think I do is trying to help graduate students navigate graduate education, because it's really, I don't find that it's the content that trips up graduate students. It's actually the policy, process, and politics that are involved in it. Now, you might say that that's the trick in every job, but certainly for graduate students, that's the challenge. So with that, I'm Jamie Moeller. This is a Grad Connection. Hope you have a great weekend. Thanks.